Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm Erin Graber, a Senior Manager for Policy and Communications and Sector Lead for Environment, Energy, and Climate Change here at JPAL North America. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar on state and local responses to climate change. This is the second event in our virtual webinar series, Charting the Next Decade of Evidence Generation. And through this series, JPAL North America is focusing on how to prioritize evaluations on today's most pressing policy problems. So this includes climate change, as well as issues such as racial equity and responding to crises like the COVID-19 pandemic that has destabilized the economic lives of communities of color and those already experiencing poverty. So I wanted to provide just a quick overview of what we'll be covering on today's webinar before we launch in. I'll be starting off today with a very brief introduction to the State and Local Innovation Initiative and our King Climate Action Initiative. And next we'll hear from Katrina Gesso, an associate professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at UC Davis. At around 11:40 Eastern time this morning, we'll start our panel discussion with some great researchers and government practitioners. And then finally, we'll have hopefully 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A with the audience. So we welcome you to submit your questions through the chat function on Zoom throughout the webinar today. And we'll try to address as many as possible during that Q&A session at the end. The webinar series is hosted by JPAL North America's State and Local Innovation Initiative, and the initiative supports state and local leaders in the United States in using randomized evaluations to generate new and widely applicable lessons about which policies and programs work, which work best, and why. Over the past 6 years, the State and Local Innovation Initiative has received proposals from 90 jurisdictions outlining randomized evaluation ideas on more than 140 promising interventions across really a range of policy areas. So this includes education, healthcare delivery, housing and homelessness, as well as labor force development. And we're currently moving more into the space of climate change and are very excited to learn from all of you who are doing important work in this area. Because many of you are new to JPAL and the work that we do, I'll provide just a very brief primer on randomized evaluation, which is also commonly referred to as impact evaluation, randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. So in the field of impact evaluation, one of the most rigorous types of evaluation is a randomized evaluation. And randomized evaluations help us to understand what would have happened if a program or policy had not taken place by comparing the outcomes of a group that receives the program, and this could be individuals, communities, schools, etc., against a group that does not receive the program. And this group is often called the comparison group. So by using random assignment to determine who is in each group, the two groups do not differ systematically at the outset of the evaluation. So really any difference that arises between these two groups, we can attribute to the program itself rather than to other factors. Great. So today we will be highlighting the momentum of efforts around climate change and pollution mitigation, what interventions state and local governments are currently implementing, and highlighting opportunities for collaboration between researchers and state and local agencies, among other practitioners, to conduct randomized evaluations in the climate change space. As a global organization, JPAL works to reduce poverty by ensuring that policy is informed by scientific evidence. Climate change really threatens to undo decades of progress in poverty alleviation and development around the world. We're also already experiencing the consequences of climate change. That's ranging from extreme weather events that damage economies and displace populations, to heat-related mortality and worsening food security. And these efforts are and will continue to disproportionately harm people experiencing poverty, both here in the US, as well as in low and middle income countries around the world. Climate change is also a multidimensional problem, as big and complex as poverty. And like poverty, there really is no silver bullet to solving it. It's also an area where rigorous evidence use is quite rare, yet policymakers need to take significant action to mitigate climate change in the next 10 to 15 years in order to avoid the worst climate scenarios. Right now, we have an opportunity. Now there is growing political will, both globally and at the state and local level in the US, and we have resources to do more on climate change today. So at JPAL, we will be seeking to build on the work that JPAL-affiliated researchers have been conducting on environment and energy issues around the globe for the past decade. Research conducted in this space has focused on a range of topics, ranging from indoor and outdoor air pollution, to market-based regulation, energy efficiency, and climate change adaptation. And this summer, JPAL also launched a new initiative, which is called the King Climate Action Initiative, or KCI. And this initiative seeks to bring more resources and focus to climate change using the JPAL approach. Globally, KCI will test and scale cost-effective, high-impact policy solutions in partnership with governments, NGOs, and firms across both developed and developing countries. As a regional office of JPAL, we at JPAL North America will be coordinating with our JPAL colleagues around the world on this new initiative. And we will be building out a research agenda for the North American context in particular that will focus on the areas of mitigation, pollution reduction, and adaptation. On mitigation, we're very cognizant that the US is the second largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world. And our work will seek to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through low-cost, high-impact behavioral and regulatory interventions. Much research to date conducted by our affiliated network in the US has focused on household energy efficiency interventions to decrease emissions. Moving forward, potential opportunities for randomized evaluation include industrial energy efficiency, regulation compliance programs, and others. On pollution reduction, we will be seeking to reduce carbon co-pollutants that have immediate health impacts, recognizing that pollution and environmental toxins disproportionately impact low-income populations and people of color due to structural disparities and discrimination. So the same activities that generate carbon emissions, such as the combustion of fossil fuels, also generate other pollutants such as particulate matter. And these co-pollutants have immediate and local effects on health and productivity, killing over 4 million people globally every year. Unlike greenhouse gases, which are global pollutants, local pollutants can be tackled by national or even city and state governments. And at the same time, by cleaning up local pollutants, we can see climate co-benefits, as in the case, for example, when we work to reduce vehicle emissions. On adaptation, we're seeking to lower the burdens that climate change creates. And as with co-pollutants, structural disparities and discrimination have again led to low-income populations and people of color being particularly burdened to adapt to a range of climate change-related hazards. So we'll be looking for opportunities to conduct research on programs and policies to support adaptation to climate change in North America. And this could include conducting evaluations on programs that invest in resilient physical and social infrastructure, support agricultural institutions and workers in adapting to climate conditions, or training communities for emergency preparedness. So in closing, the State and Local Innovation Initiative and KCI are providing more resources and opportunities to bring JPAL's approach and rigor to climate change policy. So we'll be looking to build a network of researchers and policymakers who can test and scale evidence-based climate change solutions. But most importantly, we want to collaborate with and really learn from experts from other disciplines, including so many of you on today's webinar, who are already tackling this challenge. So we'll be seeking to collaborate with state and local government agencies, technology developers, climate and social scientists, policymakers, and NGOs to bring scientific and engineering innovations into the policy domain. And we're really excited to learn about and test strategies for community level needs, programs, and policies. So with this background, it's now my pleasure to introduce Katrina Gesso, an associate professor of agriculture and resource economics at UC Davis. She's also a researcher in the JPAL network. So we're thrilled to hear from Katrina today about her current research priorities, including pricing and conservation policies in the water and electricity sectors in California. Welcome, Katrina.
Okay, so my hope is everyone can hear me and everyone can see me as well as my slides. So my name is Katrina Gesso. I'm thrilled to be here today virtually. Erin, thanks for the very nice introduction. And what I want to talk about today is environment, climate, and energy broadly, and how research can inform policy. And I just want to kind of start out by saying kind of one feature that's woven throughout at least my research and I think it's really important for doing credible research, but also for informing policy, is that in all of my research, I almost always partner with local and state agencies or water utilities, electric utilities, or irrigation districts. Let me go to full screen, excuse me. Okay. And so what we're going to kind of be experiencing, or we are experiencing, is a changing climate. Sorry, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Okay. Is what we're going to be experiencing is a changing climate. So warming temperatures, as Erin mentioned, sea level rise, and changing precipitation patterns. Climate change is also going to bring with it more frequent and extreme events. So below I have kind of just some photos of some of these. So right now, kind of making the headlines are these wildfires that are dominating California. And so that's the upper right-hand corner. And with these wildfires is also coming kind of really bad air pollution, of which kind of the health costs are going to be monumental. And so in the upper left, I have just a picture of kind of the smoke and the particulate matter that's associated with these wildfires. We're also seeing more frequent and severe hurricanes, as well as more frequent and severe droughts. And so as researchers, kind of collectively, we're really interested in figuring out how to combat climate change. And at least in my mind, kind of what I think kind of motivates us are three things. The first is measuring the costs of climate change. So what are the costs of climate change on agriculture, on human health, labor markets, migration, violence, and more? The second thing we're interested in asking is, how can we go about reducing greenhouse gas emissions? That is mitigation. So some examples of this are carbon tax or cap and trade, energy efficiency policies, or renewable portfolio standards. All these tools are being deployed in an effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A third question we're interested in asking, generally speaking, is how can we go about adapting to or lessening the costs of climate change? So what are some examples of this? Well, kind of what some research has shown us is that extreme heat is associated or kind of leads to negative health outcomes. And this link can be kind of dampened through the use of air conditioning. So air conditioning works as kind of an adaptation strategy to lessen the human health costs from extreme heat. Another example of this is the possibility of deploying water markets as an adaptation strategy to lessen the costs associated with drought, whereas we expect droughts to become more frequent and more severe with climate change. Now, kind of in real time, what we're seeing at the local, state, national, and international level is policies kind of being deployed, taking shape, and evolving that kind of collectively seek to tackle climate change. And I highlight kind of a few of these that are occurring in California right now. So we have a cap and trade for greenhouse gas emissions, which kind of seek to reduce emissions, the last time I checked, by about 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. The governor also recently proposed a ban on the sales of new gasoline-powered vehicles. We have renewable portfolio standards, which seek to generate, in which kind of they seek to generate about 60% of electricity sales from renewables by 2030. We had, in response to the 2015 historic drought, a 25% urban conservation mandate. And we have the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014 that seeks to manage groundwater supplies. Now, collectively, what all these regulations are tackling is climate change. They're being deployed, and they're also kind of evolving and updating in real time. However, it's really important that we take stock of what works as we go about addressing and tackling climate change, right? That there were kind of systematic and measured about evaluating kind of how these policies perform. And what I mean by that is we're interested in asking, what are the effects of issued or proposed policies on local pollution, on greenhouse gas emissions, on water quantity or water quality? How cost effective are these different policies? For example, in California, we're using both kind of renewable portfolio standards and cap and trade. One question to ask is, what's the cost to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 1 ton? So how do these different policies stack up in terms of cost effectiveness? And a third consideration when taking stock of what works is how are the benefits and costs of these policies distributed? So who bears the cost of mitigation or adaptation programs, and who bears the benefits? And this is where collaboration is key, right? Through partnerships and collaborations with agencies, utilities, firms, and NGOs, we can start to take stock of kind of the impacts of different policies, the cost effectiveness of these policies, and how kind of the benefits and costs of these policies are distributed. So what I just highlight here, and kind of many researchers are doing this, are some of my collaborations. So in my work, I've collaborated with the Department of Water Resources, the California Public Utilities Commission. I've collaborated with a number of utilities: Burbank Water and Power, Modesto, Riverside, East Bay Mud, Southern California Gas, Pacific Gas and Electric, the Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency. And collectively, one reason why kind of these collaborations form is that these agencies or these utilities are really interested in either kind of designing policy or learning how to comply with local and state policy. And often how we go about learning about how to comply with policy or learning how to design policy is through collaborations and randomized control trials. So kind of some of these include a randomized control trial that seeks to kind of understand whether water conservation instruments should count as an energy efficiency tool. So right now, the state of California is trying to figure out whether water conservation instruments should be part of their energy efficiency portfolio. What we've done is we've launched an RCT that seeks to look at the impact of a water conservation instrument on energy use, as well as the cost effectiveness of that water conservation instrument in achieving energy conservation. The second question or kind of partnership that we've had is the Department of Water Resources was interested in learning how water conservation instruments perform in disadvantaged communities. So we collaborated with some public utilities as well as the Department of Water Resources to launch a randomized controls trial that evaluated how social norms comparisons perform in these communities. And then lastly, we partnered with a local utility, or a public utility, I should say, to understand or kind of to test different approaches to complying with the 25 conservation mandate that was kind of placed on utilities during the 2015 drought. And what I have below is a figure that kind of provides a summary of this randomized control trial. So what we did in this randomized control trial is we either assigned a household in this utility to a control group or one of 3 treatment groups that all differed in costs and the combination of water conservation instruments deployed. Then what we did was we measured water use before the treatment, and you can see prior to the gray shaded area, water use looks similar across all 3 groups. Then we launched the experiment. And what we see is that water use for all 3 of these treatment groups reduces relative to those in the control group. We also find that once this experiment ended, so this is the area shaded in white to the right of the gray shaded area, that about I want to say about 11 months post-experiment, water use was similar across all 3 groups. So what did we learn from this experiment? Well, we learned that all 3 instruments yielded the same water conservation. However, the costs of deploying these differ. So the cost effectiveness of these instruments differ. So we were able to provide the utility with some information on the most cost-effective policy that they could use to address water conservation amongst these 3. Now, what I want to spend my time talking a little bit about in detail today is climate change and water supplies in California. So what we know is that climate change is going to meaningfully alter water supplies throughout the state. And this is going to happen through a handful of channels. First, climate change is going to impact water supplies through increased temperatures. And so when temperatures warm, the form of precipitation is going to change. So though the total amount of precipitation will remain the same perhaps, we're going to have less snow and more rain. So why does this matter? Well, our biggest reservoir in California is the Sierra snowpack. And if we have less snow and more rain, we're not going to be able to store as much precipitation in this huge and critical reservoir. A second thing that's going to happen is with increased temperature, we're going to change the timing of water supplies. So right now, when temperature is warm, that snow melts and it kind of runs down the mountains and it supplies water during the late spring and early summer when it's in highest demand among agriculture. When we have an earlier melting of the snowpack with warmer temperatures, there may be a mismatch between when the surface water is supplied and when it's demanded. Second, climate change is going to lead to more variable precipitation. So though some of the projections suggest that average precipitation won't change, we're going to have a lot more variability. So we're going to have more frequent and severe droughts, as well as an increase in flooding. Third, we're also going to have saltwater intrusion. So with sea level rise, you can imagine that some of these groundwater resources are going to get saltier, right? So it's going to impact, sea level rise is going to impact water quality for some groundwater sources. And fourth, with kind of an increase in droughts, what we're likely going to have is an increased reliance on groundwater supplies. So in California, kind of the statistics differ depending on where you look, but up to 40% of water use in a given year comes from, on average, groundwater as compared to surface water. During droughts, groundwater may supply up to 80% of water supplies. And so we know that climate change is going to also kind of substantially change kind of groundwater availability and our reliance on groundwater. And so within this lens, what I want to focus on is two things. The first thing I want to focus on is the impact of drought on drinking water in rural communities. And so throughout most of California, drinking water quality is pretty good. However, in some areas, this is not the case. And where I want to take you to is the San Joaquin Valley. So if you look at this figure below, in these kind of two blue bounded areas, we have the San Joaquin Valley. Now, the San Joaquin Valley is home to more than half of the non-compliant systems in California. What I mean by this is when a drinking water violation is occurring, in over half the instances, it's occurring in the San Joaquin Valley. What are the demographics of this area? Well, 52% of residents in this area are Hispanic or Mexican, and about a quarter of households fall below the poverty line. If we went and we stack up all the counties in California in terms of the poverty rate, the 6 counties with the highest poverty rate are located within the San Joaquin Valley. Groundwater, as compared to surface water, supplies drinking water for about 90% of residents. Most of these residents get their water from one of 3 kind of groundwater sources. The first are small community systems. These are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So when I'm talking about these non-compliant systems, I'm talking about these small community systems. However, residents also get their water from unincorporated systems that are not regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act, but are often monitored by the county. Or they get their water from domestic wells, which are not regulated. So we know that small community systems are often in non-compliance, and we just don't have a great sense of how these unincorporated systems or domestic systems are performing kind of systematically in terms of water quality. So kind of these areas suffer from issues related to water quality as well as access to drinking water. So before I explain why, I want to go back to this map. And so what the Department of Water Resources and the PPIC kind of so nicely have kind of plotted out for us is they've plotted out for us kind of groundwater overdraft, how much groundwater is being taken out. And what you see is that in this dark orange area, most of it falls within the San Joaquin Valley. And these dark orange areas highlight areas where groundwater is critically overdrafted. So this means the water table has dropped a lot, and it could be really costly to extract water, or your well may simply run dry. Overdraft may also lead to increased contamination. So in this area, what we see happening, sorry, I just keep checking the chat to make sure my sound is working. What we see happening is that drinking water quality standards are often violated because of overdraft. So naturally occurring contaminants like arsenic, when you're taking out water, the remaining stock gets more contaminated with these naturally occurring contaminants from imports from fertilizer application. Access to drinking water is also an issue here. So during the 2012 to 2016 drought, it was estimated that about 2,300 wells ran dry. So kind of a first question that I'm interested in asking is, what is the cost of drought on access to and quality of drinking water in these disadvantaged communities? Asking this question is going to require agency collaboration at the state level and the local level. Why is this? Well, many of these users are getting their water from domestic wells. Domestic wells in the San Joaquin Valley outnumber public and agricultural wells. Recently, the Department of Water Resources released 100 years worth of digitized well completion reports. So what I've provided below, and this is from a really nice paper by Palu, Graham Fogg, and others, in which they took these well completion reports and they digitized them. We see those domestic wells located throughout the Central Valley of California. And then what they were able to do is get from the state self-reported well failures. And so in the B part of the panel, they map out these well failures. Right? So what I think is really critical to do is to kind of, again, collaborate with the agency to get information on self-reported well failures with the Department of Water Resources, and perhaps, and likely, or hopefully, collaborate with local agencies to also get a sense for kind of well failures at a bigger scale, right? Which ones aren't reported? What other issues do we have in terms of kind of water quality or increased pumping costs? And so collaboration here will allow us to isolate the effect of droughts on drinking water quality, the cost of accessing drinking water, and whether kind of domestic wells fails in these areas. So kind of the first question is about kind of measuring the costs of climate change as measured through the costs of drought on access to and quality of drinking water in these communities. A second question of interest is, how do we go about adapting to changing water conditions? And so the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014 is this kind of hallmark regulation in California. So historically, groundwater in the state has been unmonitored and unregulated. And what has this led to is kind of during times of drought, when we see these reductions in surface water supplies, people are turning to groundwater and extracting it. And what we have happening is we have groundwater levels falling, we have kind of increases in groundwater contamination. And so the state came in and they approved the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014. And what this requires, among other things, for states to do is to design plans to achieve sustainable groundwater levels. The way that this is occurring is each basin, and there's about 150 basins, are coming up with these unique plans. And in the state of California, there's been 250 plus groundwater sustainability agencies that have formed. And each of these 250 agencies is coming up with a plan, an individualized plan, on how it's going to comply with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And each of these groundwater sustainability plans represent a bundle of supply side instruments and demand side instruments, kind of meant kind of in the big scheme of things to kind of improve climate resiliency or make us kind of more climate resilient. And so these are a mix of supply side instruments such as groundwater replenishment and demand side instruments, maybe a cap and trade program. However, kind of what we have right now is a smorgasbord of sorts of instruments. Different plans have a different mix of instruments, and we just have different instruments being used in each plan. But what we need to do is we need to have kind of a systematic and credible evaluation of each lever of compliance. What this will allow us to do is it will allow us to kind of evaluate the impact of each instrument on water quantity and water quality. it will allow us to stack up how each of these instruments perform in terms of cost effectiveness, and it will allow us to get a sense as well as kind of the distribution of the costs and benefits of each of these instruments. I also want to kind of close out this slide by saying kind of another thing that stymies systematic and credible evaluation of compliance with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is just that we don't have this kind of consistent and systematic accounting of consumption and replenishment in groundwater basins. So we don't always know how much water is actually being used and how much is being replenished. And so this is a really kind of nice opportunity for research. Right? We have little empirical evidence. And what I want to show is kind of an example of kind of one type of partnership that we could kind of expand on. And so some irrigation districts are currently using groundwater pricing, a few, to manage groundwater quality and quantity. And where these are occurring is these are occurring in locations where water quality has already been compromised or water quantity is declining such that these utilities preemptively acted. These are areas kind of where groundwater is actually being monitored. So what I have is an example here of a price being implemented in one irrigation district in which all agricultural users faced a single price. And then we have this split in price between these two users groups. And what we can do is we can compare water use across those facing a high price and a low price to get a sense for the impact of price on water use. However, research collaborations will allow us to figure out kind of what works and what doesn't work in terms of managing groundwater and hopefully kind of scale up to some kind of broader lessons. The last thing I briefly want to talk about is water affordability. So recently, AB 401, which is the Low Income Rate Assistance Water Assistance Act, and I call it the Low Income Rate Water Assistance Act, was issued by the state. And what this does is it's going to kind of provide a water affordability mandate. And roughly about a third of households in California would be eligible under its kind of current thinking. Currently, about 20% of the low-income population in California is enrolled in a low-income rate assistance program for water, and about 40% of water utilities offer a rate assistance program for water. And so what this kind of state level program seeks to do is to kind of introduce this type of program at a state level. What's a lot under question right now is how to go about issuing this program. So some things on the table are utility bill credits, tax credits, or direct cash benefits. The idea here is that in California, about 72% of eligible households, or households that would be eligible for this Assistance Act, don't pay their water bill, right? So they're renters, and the water bill is likely reflected in their rent as opposed to them directly paying a water bill. And this is an area where data-driven policy is really important and could provide a lot of insights. So you can imagine we could deploy a randomized control trial in which we compare these different options, utility bill credits, tax credits, or direct cash benefits on enrollment in these programs, the costs of deploying these programs, water use, and other expenditures or enrollments in other plans. And so in other work, we're trying to chip away at this question in a very kind of small level. And so kind of this is discussions in progress with a California utility. So some utilities, including this one, have a customer assistance program in place. And in their program, they offer up to about 50% off the fixed charge in volumetric expenditures. In their district, I want to say about 40% of customers are eligible for this program, but participation is low. Only kind of less than 10% of customers are enrolling in it. And what they want to know is why, right? Is it because renters, these households are renters and they don't pay their water bill? Is it because kind of the cost of enrollment are so onerous, right? You have to kind of provide all this documentation. Or is it that they're unaware of the program? And so what we're doing is we're starting to kind of collaborate and brainstorm why it is, and hopefully kind of design an experiment together to test kind of the extent to which information explains low uptake, the extent to which high enrollment costs explain low uptake. And we're trying to kind of use account data to parse out the extent to which kind of this renter versus owner hypothesis explains low uptake. And so I just wanted to kind of thank you for your time today and look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you so much, Katrina, for your presentation. And for members of our audience who have follow-up questions for Katrina, please feel free to submit them through the chat function on Zoom, and we will try to address those questions during the end during the Q&A as well. So with that, I'd like to now welcome our additional panelists for today's discussion. We have Fiona Burlig, an assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And with collaborating researchers, Fiona is working with the California Air Resources Board on a state and local innovation initiative funded project to test the effectiveness of non-compliance notifications targeting high emitting trucks that likely exceed limits set by emissions regulations. We also have James Goldstein, a vehicle program specialist at the California Air Resources Board. And he has been working with Fiona on this evaluation. James is also a professor in the Environmental Studies Department at California State University in Sacramento. James was the executive officer of the California Air Resources Board from 2007 to 2013. And the board is responsible for promoting and protecting the public health and ecological resources of California through effective reduction of air pollutants, while recognizing and considering the effects of its action on the state's economy. And last, we have Zoe Davis, a climate resilience project coordinator on the Climate Ready team at the Environment Department in Boston. And as a project coordinator, Zoe supports the development of neighborhood climate resilience planning, the integration of climate change preparedness projections into municipal projects, planning and permit review, and the development of resources for residents, small businesses, and other stakeholders to take action. So welcome to all of you. We're so excited to have you here for today's conversation. We'll be starting today by first hearing from Fiona and James about the research partnership, and then we'll be looping in Zoe Davis to learn more about government perspectives on climate change policy priorities and evidence-based decision-making. So first, I'd love to hear from Fiona and James. Our first question is really just broadly, how did you identify emissions from heavy-duty trucks as a policy priority? And what are you excited to learn from this study?
Well, CARB many years ago identified diesel pollutant as a toxic air contaminant. And we know that most diesel pollution comes from most mobile sources, mainly heavy-duty trucks in California. And some of you may know the ports of Long Beach and LA account for about 40% of the goods that are imported into the United States. And then all of that, all those goods are transported out through trucks and rail. And so we've been studying the health impacts on diesel pollution on all Californians, and particularly in communities that are highly impacted for many years. And recently, we've been working on a program to essentially create a smog check style program for heavy duty trucks. And we've been working with Fiona and her team, and she'll talk about it, I think, in a little more detail, about how we can induce truck owners to take care of their trucks better. One of the things that we've done over the years is we've gradually required truck makers and car makers to make the engines cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. But if the engines are not well maintained, then they pollute at much higher levels than they're designed for. And so, again, using a randomized study that Fiona and team developed, we're complementing the work we do on the technical and engineering side with hopefully finding good strategies to change maintenance behavior in our heavy duty fleet. And we have about 1 million trucks on the road in California moving goods around at any time from all over the country. I don't know, Fiona, if you want to start talking about the
Yeah, I'll jump in
project
just a
we're
little
working
bit
on?
there.
Yeah, yeah.
So from a kind of researcher's perspective, so I work with a large group at the University of Chicago called the Energy and Environment Lab, which is sort of a set of faculty and staff who are interested in collaborating with policymakers to try and develop kind of evidence-based approaches for improving environmental quality. And so we have been talking to CARB for several years, and as we heard James and his team talking about the diesel truck emissions problem, like I think we were pretty surprised at the scope of the issue. When you think about pollution, we normally think about, you know, the big power plant with the smokestack that looks terrible or lots of cars. It's not necessarily, or at least in my mind, diesel trucks weren't something that came up right away as a really important policy issue. But the more we started talking to the folks at CARB, we realized just the scope of this particular challenge. And then the other piece that got us really excited about this collaboration was that CARB is facing a difficulty that is sort of not unique to California, but is something that I think is a really pervasive challenge in environmental policy or in environmental regulation, which is how do I take a really stringent regulation that's on the books and actually make sure I'm enforcing that at a low cost as possible, right? So California has always been a leader in environmental regulation, and the kind of official rules are actually pretty strict. The challenge has been, as James mentioned, there aren't sort of smog check-like programs for trucks in the same way that there are for cars. And so actually cracking down on violators is something that's been historically challenging. And so in the project that we're working on together, we're basically piloting a new remote sensing technology to try and help us identify the most polluting trucks and then actually come after them with a series of different enforcement strategies, as compared to the status quo where trucks are sort of apprehended if you see them driving by and emitting a huge plume of smoke or someone submits a complaint. There are definitely roadside inspections that are happening, but those are costly and hard to target. So the goal of our partnership is to try and find new ways using this new technology that CARB has developed to try and lower the costs of effective compliance.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for providing that overview. I'm wondering if you could also speak a bit to what some of the challenges and potentially the opportunities are that you've encountered in terms of measuring the impact of this intervention on those communities that are most vulnerable to and really affected by emissions from trucks.
One of the strategies, Fiona just mentioned the remote sensing systems that we've been building. One of the benefits of using remote sensing is that we can deploy sensors around the state and specifically in areas most impacted. And so while we're going to probably install the sensors at border crossings so we can make sure that we're measuring in-state trucks and out-of-state trucks equally, we can also deploy these systems. Some would eventually be permanently mounted, and some would be portable in areas that we know where there's a high volume of truck traffic that's impacting the local community. So really what we're doing is we're using technology to identify the high emitters and then coming up with strategies, and this is where Fiona and her team are helping us, coming up with strategies to get those truckers to come in and maintain their trucks. One of the challenges is that trying to reach 1 million truck owners all the time is hard. Now, of course, it's not 1 million owners, but it's 1 million trucks. And so how do we find them? We assume most of them are actually in compliance. And now with newer technologies on the trucks, you mostly don't see smoke anymore in California because they have diesel particulate filters installed. But you have to maintain the upstream components in your engine to make sure those filters are working properly. And so our systems actually take an emission snapshot of the pollutants coming out of the tailpipe, either above or below the truck, updraft or downdraft. Downdraft is becoming more common in trucks, so we have to be able to measure it below or above. We take that information, we link it to a license plate camera read, and then we can figure out who owns the truck. And then we're asking Fiona and her team to develop this randomized control trial that they're doing, and she'll talk about that maybe in a little more detail, but the different treatments, to see what the best way there is to incentivize or induce maintenance on the truck so the trucks come back into compliance. As Fiona mentioned, our rules are pretty strict, and they've gotten stricter over time. But if you don't maintain your vehicle, then your vehicle can be polluting many times higher than what is allowed under the law.
Yeah, I think the challenge that we saw coming in was basically a challenge that researchers face all over the place, which is just limited data, right? So in order for us to help bring trucks into compliance and even measure compliance in the first place, we need to have some kind of information. And so that's, I think, why we were so excited about working with CARB on this new technology, because it gives us an opportunity to measure compliance beyond self-reported administrative records and really actually take a measurement of what is the emissions, or sorry, what are the emissions coming out of this truck at a given point in time. And as James mentioned, what's cool about this particular system is there are multiple versions of it. So there's a couple of sort of more, so you can think of it as sort of semi-permanent installations, but then there's also a few mobile versions. So we can think about deploying things in different locations around the state. But I think the first order innovation here is finding a good way to actually measure emissions from these trucks. And then the second piece that we're trying to layer on top of that is, okay, what do we do with this new information? Can we actually develop strategies to effectively target trucks that are likely to come into compliance with some targeting, and what's the right way that we can get truckers to really come into compliance with those regulations? That's very hard to do if you don't have any data on their emissions. Like, you can send out 1 million letters if you want and say, hey, you need to be in compliance with this regulation, did you know? But that's unlikely to be effective, right, on average. Whereas if you can much more closely target, hey, your truck was seen at this time in this location to have a substantially higher emissions reading than we're expecting, that all of a sudden starts to sound a little scarier. And I think can help induce compliance. So we're in sort of the piloting phase for the randomized trial at the moment, with the eventual goal of basically taking these trucks that have been identified through this remote sensing technology as high emissions and randomizing them into a couple of different treatments to try and get them to actually comply with the regulations. So you can think about one of those treatments as a pretty low cost, but potentially lower impact intervention, right? So that's sending a letter to a trucker and saying, hey, we saw you having high emissions on this date. And then they're supposed to send in compliance documentation. That's not a super heavy-handed intervention in the sense that, we're just sending you a letter basically saying you're out of compliance with a regulation that you probably knew you were already out of compliance with. And then we're also going to compare that against a heavier-handed intervention where we're actually doing a much fuller audit of an entire fleet's books and can actually come and enforce a series of different regulations if we find that truckers are out of compliance with those. And so the goal is to basically horse race something that's much cheaper to do, but potentially has a little bit less of a stick on the back end versus something that's more costly on from CARB's perspective, but could also catch more truckers engaging in bad behavior. As I mentioned, we're only in the pilot phase of this now, so we've sent out about 50 of these kind of low impact letters, but actually even that is having a surprising impact. So we've already had a bunch of responses from truckers, including people saying, oh, yep, you've actually caught me engaging in this illegal behavior. Now let me submit my new compliance documentation to you. So we are kind of excited about this potential for really heavily targeted interventions to try and improve compliance in this setting. But it's really the kind of advent of new data sources that's allowing us to do this targeting in an effective way.
That's fascinating. And I feel like we could probably have a webinar just on your project because there's so many aspects to it and it's really interesting to hear from you. I might take us a little bit broader now and just reflect a bit about the research partnership that exists here. And, from James, I'd love to hear from you a bit about, from your perspective as a policymaker, what has really been the value of working with researchers? What has this allowed you to do that perhaps would have been difficult for CARB on its own?
Well, like Katrina was talking about, we're going to use the data and the science to help drive policy, where we're identifying a problem. And a lot of the solutions to the problems we've identified using science relative to climate and air pollution require or need engineering solutions and behavioral solutions, right? So there's like two strategies generally. One is, well, can you make the engine better? Can you improve the fuel? Can you reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel? Can you come up with other technological solutions that can, in a cost-effective way, in a way that's technologically feasible, help solve the problem? But that only goes so far. Eventually, you need also to look at how we live. And one of the great things about the partnership with the University of Chicago and Fiona and her team is that they're bringing a skill set that we don't have that much of within CARB. We are very good on the science and the engineering side. We can sort of look forward to the future and project when new technologies could or should be developed and whether they're going to be cost effective. But we don't have many behavioral economists in-house. And what Fiona is, right, they bring a whole different way of looking at the world that complements our science and engineering skills. And so that's been very exciting for us. And in fact, the work that Fiona is doing also could be used in other areas that we have within CARB, but this is really the first major effort. Because we also need to get into compliance under the Clean Air Act, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, the same area that Katrina was talking about that has the drought problem, and in major parts of LA and Riverside and the southern eastern parts of California. We really need to tackle the air quality problems generated by the trucks, because we just have so much activity. I think Fiona stated it right. We know that many truckers know that they're out of compliance, but it's very hard for them to take the truck out of service for repair, because any time the truck is not running, they're not making money. And the repairs can be very costly. So one of the other things that we're looking at is whether or not, once we start a full-blown smog check program for heavy-duty trucks, whether we need to provide some sort of subsidy for small truckers who can't afford $5,000 or $10,000 in repairs. It's very expensive to repair the trucks. We have a similar program in our light-duty program for smog check, where if you are low income, the state will provide support to help pay for repairs and get you into compliance. So we're looking at that as well, because programs like this, while they're ensuring compliance, they can hit some people pretty hard from an economic side.
No, that's great. Thank you, James. And just to make sure that we have enough time for a number of questions that we're hoping to discuss with the panel, I might switch gears a little bit and now look a bit at government perspectives and really your policy priorities and your work with vulnerable communities. So as we've mentioned, the webinar series is about state and local initiatives, and through these discussions, we're really seeking to learn about the government perspective on their policy priorities. So I'd love to have Zoe join the conversation now. Zoe, can you share with us some of your thoughts on kind of the holistic nature of planning climate resilience interventions?
Yeah, sure. So I think an important thing to remember is that climate change, the climate crisis, even individual climate-related, like acute climate-related risks, they don't happen in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is that there are a number of factors and cascading effects that are influenced by climate change and that affect the lives of real people. And so there's just, in climate planning, thinking about the intersectionality of multiple risks, whether it's climate, social, health. All of this requires a holistic and inclusive approach to planning. So just thinking on the built environment side, at least within the city of Boston or other coastal municipalities in the metro region, and I'm sure many others across the country, we contend with the compounding climate risks of stormwater flooding on top of coastal flooding from sea level rise and intensifying storms. So in this case, what we're doing is, or what's in our headspace is critically looking at where we can integrate stormwater infrastructure into coastal resilient solutions, whether that's integrating pump stations or tide gates into like elevated berms, or just working closely with our Boston Water and Sewer Commission to identify where we need to be putting and planning infrastructure. That's been really critical, and in the space of just integrating planning moving forward, specifically to flooding interventions. So as I mentioned, the built environment and the human experience, they affect one another. So for example, when we're thinking about urban heat and heat risk, thinking of ways to integrate solutions that consider human health and the human experience, transportation infrastructure, and how that relates to access to cooling spaces, whether it's an actual cooling center or public parks. Thinking about that within the context of heat mitigating green infrastructure, where we're planting trees, where community is asking for trees, where trees actually fit. We're trying to integrate that all into our planning. And so for my team on Climate Ready, that's the majority of where we work, is integrate an integrated systems approach. And so, you know, in thinking about policy and planning moving forward, just making sure that other processes, other departments are integrating resilience is sort of like at the core of what we're looking at.
Oh, that's great. That's really helpful to hear in detail. And kind of building on that, you've mentioned that there's so much that you're working on, and there's this intersectionality between these different components within your approach to climate change adaptation efforts. How do you set priorities, right? So you're talking about so many different aspects, and I think it would be really helpful for us to hear a bit about how you're setting the priorities for the particular programs and initiatives that you're moving forward, and perhaps how you may be using data and making some of those decisions.
Yeah, so our prioritization is set and really informed by data. So just a brief history, the development of Climate Ready Boston, which is the city of Boston's plan to prepare for the impacts of climate change. It was designed and based on data that was produced in the Boston Research Advisory Group's report. The Bragg report is what we call it. And so what that report did was it coalesced information from climate models so that we can understand the impacts of stormwater flooding, coastal flooding, and rising temperatures, looking specifically at extreme heat. And in addition to that, we've worked very closely with Woods Hole Group that produced the Boston Harbor Flood Risk Model. And so that has been really critical to identifying the time horizons by which we need to be implementing, especially coastal resilience solutions. And so that is one, if not the primary factor when we're thinking about prioritization, but there are a number of other factors that we're looking at beyond the timing of the risk. But we're also looking at things like the capital improvement cycles, and thinking about development. There are opportunistic moments in development where there could be a project being built in one of the climate resilient sort of areas that we've been planning in. And so connecting with developers and the BPDA to sort of coordinate where can we be implementing resilient solutions in that moment is also critical. And then of course, considering environmental justice factors, such as low income areas where we can be sort of adding value creation in neighborhoods, considering where there are populations of people of color, folks with limited English language proficiency. And so those are just a few of the factors that we're looking at, but you're definitely right. It's not just about the climate risk itself.
Thank you for that. And actually that leads quite well into one of the other questions that I think we'd really like to focus on. While climate change is a global phenomenon, its effects are really felt locally. And as we've been discussing, the effects really do fall disproportionately on low-income communities and communities of color. So it's helpful to hear from you, how you're factoring that into some of the decisions that you're making. So I'd love to hear, a little bit more from you and also from you, James, on, how your knowledge of these disproportionate burdens shape your work and how it might make you or kind of lead you to select certain policies or shape the way that you choose to involve communities in the decision-making process.
Yeah, so a few things come to mind in that. One is centering the voices and experiences of priority communities and priority populations throughout the process and into the outcome of the planning. So, when we're thinking about community engagement and outreach, really understanding the human experience in the day-to-day. Yes, we're looking at future climate risk and we're looking at future resilient solutions, but we also have to be, cognizant of the fact that the effects of climate change are being felt today. So really considering the experience of people in the day-to-day is critical. And also clearly reflecting that in the development of the climate adaptation interventions so that they will work for actual people. And in addition to that, recognizing the history of intentional disinvestment in communities of color and in immigrant communities, and also reflecting that in the work moving forward. One thing specifically is, even in the early, or I should say, especially in the early planning phase, starting with the procurement of services. From my experience, residents really want to interface with project team members, and a project team that they feel resonates with what they value, folks who live in their neighborhood or are familiar with their neighborhood. And so what does that mean? It means integrating equitable procurement practices from the very beginning so that local and small businesses, women-owned businesses, and businesses owned by people of color, making sure that they have the opportunity to get into this process so that they can be representing the neighborhoods that we're working in. And I mean, another is recognizing community expertise, community power, and community knowledge. Residents and community folk need to be integrated into the processes that are going to be affecting their neighborhoods. So one way we're thinking about that is building processes and solutions with community partners, co-creation. And finally, I'll just say, making time and space for meaningful dialogue in community identified spaces. So one example of that is when we were working through coastal resilience planning in the Dorchester neighborhood. We were meeting with neighborhood associations and community groups within the Dorchester project area, outside of just the few scheduled open houses. And so that was sort of like an intimate space for critical dialogue to really understand what it was that people were looking for, what they loved about the space, where they could see it changing. And it was also an incredible personal experience for me as a resident of the Roxbury-Dorchester area at the time. So those are just a couple thoughts, but yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Zoe, for providing such specific examples too. I think that's really helpful. And James, I wanted to open it up to you as well to see if you had additional thoughts from CARB.
Well, I think one of the things that we're always paying attention to is making sure that communities that have a disproportionate burden of pollution are able to communicate with us. We have relationships all over the states with community groups in all areas. We have a whole office or division set up to reach out to communities that are disproportionately impacted for air and climate pollutants. There is, and I'm not sure if people know that within Cali, PA, there's an Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and they put out a report called Cal EnviroScreen, which looks at about 17 or 19 different potential burdens in communities by census tract or zip code. And you can look at everything from water quality to air quality to education level, language isolation, and other things. And so that gets updated every once in a while, and we do use that to help drive the deployment of our policies and engagement with communities around the state.
Well, that's great. Thank you, James. And following up on that, I'd also love to bring our researchers into this conversation. And, Fiona and Katrina, would love to hear what advice you might have for state and local decision makers who are looking to use data to help them understand the climate impacts on priority communities, these communities that are feeling the impacts disproportionately. Anything else that you'd like to add here?
Yeah, I think, this is obviously a difficult problem. Again, I'll sort of circle back to something I said at the beginning, which is I think that measurement here is really key, right? So it's really hard to understand how to effectively design an intervention if we can't observe what's happening on the ground. And I think something that you often see is that communities of color and low-income communities are also underserved by the same measurement resources that help us to inform effective solutions, right? So if, for example, I'm interested in using pollution monitoring and none of the monitors sit in a low-income community, then I'm just going to be blind to the impacts, and it's difficult for me to then actually address a problem that I can't see, right? So one set of solutions to this is developing kind of innovative ways to do new measurement like we're doing with CARB. Another way is to leverage things like satellite data and new sources of information that are coming out that actually allow us to kind of get a window into places that are harder to see based on kind of physical monitoring technology. But then I think also in the partnership between the researchers and the policymakers, really trying to understand not just what are the average impacts, but looking for that heterogeneity and trying to actually understand whether different interventions have different effectiveness in different locations is really important, because there's also questions about, differential costs of emissions and differential costs of emissions regulation, right? So something that seems like relatively cheap to a middle income household might actually be a really expensive adaptation solution for a low income household. And so I think, as James was kind of discussing, finding ways for these single owner or single truck fleets to actually bring themselves into compliance is, not as cheap as we might think it would be for a fleet like FedEx, for instance, right? And so helping to keep those small businesses up and running while bringing them into compliance is important. And so I think there's, sort of a bunch of different pieces of the policy puzzle. I like to think of the economist's role as helping us to find ways to do things as cheaply as possible, right? If your tomatoes in the grocery store were $500 a bag, all of a sudden we're going to stop buying tomatoes. And so I think this sort of similar thing with climate and local pollution is if we can find ways to bring down the costs of regulation, the cost of enforcement, and the cost of achieving mitigation and adaptation, we're going to collectively be willing to invest more in it. It's just a question of making sure that as we do that, we also don't tilt the scales and develop really regressive policies. one thing that is exciting, I think, is there's a lot of tools from economics and from the policy space that can be brought together to make sure that our climate and pollution policies aren't regressive and are in fact progressive. Like that's absolutely within the scope of policy design. You just need to make sure that that's something you're thinking about as you're setting up the policy to begin with.
That's great. And Katrina, anything else to add from your end?
Yeah, I mean, kind of yes to all the stuff Fiona said. One other thing I think kind of Fiona touched upon as well is like what kind of we can do as economists well is in terms of research design, right? And so kind of if kind of these data are available and we're trying to kind of understand kind of the climate impacts or mitigation options or kind of ways of adaptation, kind of where the economists can come in is terms of research design, kind of how do we design an evaluation strategy such that we can use the data to kind of answer the question we're after in a credible way.
Great. Thanks so much for that. And, you know, before we turn it over to the audience and go specifically to some of the questions that they've raised, I'd love just to kind of circle back and again, you know, with JPAL's approach and the focus on randomized evaluation, I'd love to hear from each of you briefly about where else you think we could really benefit from randomized evaluation in the study of climate change initiatives. You know, are there programs or policies that you are excited or curious about beyond what we've discussed here? But there really needs to be more evidence to determine the way forward. And, you know, I think kind of selfishly, I'm asking this question because this is really an area where we're looking to build out a research agenda for climate change, environment, and energy questions for the state and local innovation initiatives. So would love to hear your thoughts.
So one thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently is this question of electrification, right? So we think about the overall plan to address climate change in the West as essentially sort of step one, make the electricity grid cleaner, and then step two, put as much stuff into that electric grid as possible, right? You can see my nice background. I think a lot about electricity. But I think we still have very limited evidence on a series of important responses to that type of electrification push. So how do we actually get consumers to choose energy efficient technologies? We know a little bit about, part of that is making sure that those technologies are effective. I think a future area of work is thinking, sort of that I've been thinking about a bunch recently, is electric vehicles. So we are really counting, especially in California now with the sort of recent governor's announcement, counting on vehicle electrification as, you know, a primary way to reduce climate damages and local pollution from the transportation sector. But we actually have very little evidence on how much people drive their cars, whether they actually treat EVs as an effective substitute for a gas-powered vehicle. So are we looking towards a car fleet in 50 years that's really going to be transitioned all the way to electric? Or are we thinking about something that's going to be a much more hybrid mix of internal combustion engines and EVs, and then thinking about, you know, how do we incentivize people to adopt these cars as well as to drive them? What does it actually look like for a consumer to engage in vehicle electrification? You know, that's one example. You can also think about switching from natural gas heat to electric heat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think this is a big sort of set of open policy questions: is how do we, you know, guide policy towards electrification? We've done a lot of work on how do we clean up the grid. I think we know a lot less about the second piece of getting people into these new technology spaces.
So one thing that comes to mind for me is working around heat resilience and where that could fit in with behavior change campaigning and building community resilience in some of the more programmatic spaces. I think it's really critical to understand how the human behavior affects risk and response. We know that people know that it is hot and we know that they feel the heat, but understanding their, like really digging into their knowledge about heat risk, their attitudes, do they feel vulnerable? If not, why? Where do they go when it gets hot? Why or why not? So just their practices, whether they can access the resources that are available, whether they access city resources or other resources, what their social capital looks like and how that affects their response and resilience. So yeah, those are some of the things that we would like to better understand so that we can develop more targeted approaches and sort of help to inform the more programmatic aspects of building heat resilience. And I'll just also just thinking about how that ties in with like emergency management and emergency response, into how that ties into long-term resilience planning. That's been a space that we're trying to explore as well.
So where my kind of headspace is kind of these days is obviously in terms of kind of changing water supplies in response to climate change. And so what I'm really interested in thinking about, kind of if I could do kind of my dream scenario, it would be starting, so in California, what we have is we have this kind of really dated way of allocating water. So certain people get water, others don't, and it's really hard to do transfers. And so I think kind of there could be a number of opportunities to have kind of deployed RCTs to look at what would be the impact of water markets. What would be, how would we design water markets in which we could kind of store water and sell that stored water, in which we had trade between urban and agricultural users. It would also be really interesting in this strain to also look at not only kind of what's the cost of kind of how can we mitigate or adapt to kind of climate change through water markets, but also kind of how are those costs and benefits going to be distributed? So what happens to agricultural communities? What happens to workers in these communities? And so I think kind of moving forward, that's kind of research that I'm really interested in getting at in terms of kind of adaptation to changing water supplies.
Thank you. And James, anything else from you before we switch over to Q&A with the audience?
Well, the kinds of things I'm thinking about go beyond the scope of what we're talking about, but I think we definitely have a challenge in this country with the way we teach science and people's understanding of science, and the interdisciplinary nature of how science can intersect with economic issues and engineering issues. I don't know if that's something that JPAL would look at, but that's probably beyond the scope of what you're looking for.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to be keeping in mind for sure. And, you know, I feel like, again, this could also be a webinar where we could really unpack all these opportunities and really think through how we might be able to take them from idea to actual experimentation to, you know, informing policy with the results. So, you know, with that, I think we probably should turn it over to Q&A with the audience. I know a number of questions have been pouring in, and we'll try to get through as many of these as possible. One question that came in that I think really could be for any of you is kind of broad, and it's how do you choose a certain policy to get a certain outcome? So for example, if you're looking to increase water use efficiency in droughts, and you know, Katrina, having your thoughts on this would be helpful. How would you potentially measure other policy options, you know, possibly beyond looking just at water price?
Great question. So kind of the way that kind of what was kind of how the sausage was made, I would guess I would say kind of in that project is typically kind of as economists, we have a number of tools in our head or instruments in our head that we'd like to deploy. So, right, if I was going to do kind of if I could do kind of the water conservation dream study, I would have in my mind some instruments that I'd like to tackle. Then maybe those are not viable because there's regulatory constraints, right? The utility can't deploy that unless they get voters' approval, or they may be kind of budget constraints. So kind of typically what I have is I have kind of my array of instruments that I would like to test. And then maybe the utility likely has some constraints and maybe instruments that they'd like to test. And typically kind of what happens is what we eventually end up testing kind of in a very systematic way is some kind of tests or kind of areas or policies where we can come to mutual agreement. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's kind of how we land on some of the policies that we ultimately test.
That's great, thank you. And kind of related to that, this is a question, kind of for James and Fiona, what was the suite of possible interventions that you were considering, and how did you really land on the letter with monitoring information versus a full audit? You know, I think there's interest in kind of understanding if the audit kind of reflects the status quo in the baseline, and kind of now that drivers are aware that you can see their emissions, are there additional interventions that might be able to be layered on top to improve the fuel efficiency of their driving?
Well, I think the range of options were a full-blown audit of your fleet to get you into compliance, to doing nothing. And what we're trying to find is in that continuum, what level of meanness does Fiona need to display in order to get action, right? So Fiona can talk about that a little bit more. It's like, are we really nice? Are we comparing you to your neighbor or other truckers? You know, do you know, Fiona will talk about this in a little more detail, but you know, most people take care of their truck. Shouldn't you take care of yours? To, if you don't act now, something bad will happen. So Fiona, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, definitely. No, so I think sort of similar to what Katrina mentioned is that, of course, like with the research and policy partnership, we're working within the constraints of what the policy agency is actually able to do, right? So it's not feasible for me to show up and say, let's raise fines on non-compliant trucks to $10 million, because that's just not something that's kind of within the scope of CARB's policy space. And so I think, you know, as we started learning about this new technology that CARB was developing, we were discussing ways to potentially leverage that technology into actual action, and sort of settled on this, like, as I was mentioning before, kind of lower cost intervention of just the simple letter versus higher cost intervention of the audits. And, you know, we don't know what the answer is going to be yet, which of those is more bang for our buck. So that's precisely the reason to set up this rigorous randomized trial, to be able to compare against those things. I also think that, you know, this is, in my mind, like a first step, right? We have this new technology we can use. We're going to try these two interventions. I imagine that we'll learn a lot about the ways that truckers come into compliance and the challenges with doing so, and some of the administrative costs. And there's lots of, I think, you know, the benefit of doing a pilot and then a sort of small scale randomized trial is we actually can watch things happen in real time. So I definitely don't think that this is going to be the, you know, the end all and be all. Once we've sent out a letter, then we're done. The goal is to sort of start off a process of policy innovation and then build on that over time to develop more and more effective tools. So that, I think, hopefully it answers this. You know, now that trucks can sort of know that the regulator is observing things. You know, one thing that we're trying to do is be careful about unintended consequences, right? So for example, if I put up a big banner that says emissions are being measured here, one policy response by the trucker might be, hey, maybe I'm going to take a different highway to get to where I'm going, right? And so that is potentially costly because it means that the emissions are still going up, we just don't see them anymore. And so part of this is designing kind of these interventions in a way that's a little bit clever to make sure we don't run into that problem. But part of this is also measuring unintended consequences. So in our project, another thing that you might imagine would happen is trucks coming into California start to realize, hey, California is really cracking down on emissions. Maybe I'm just going to stop driving in California. So what you could end up having is all the really dirty trucks leave California. That seems great from a California perspective, but maybe is really terrible for Nevada, right? And so one of the things we're also trying to measure is, are truckers doing other things to try and avoid these California regulations, potentially registering in other states where it's harder for us to crack down on them, things like that. And so as we're doing this evaluation, trying to kind of think of as many of the possible unintended consequences as we can, so that we can also try and measure those things to make sure that we get a big picture of what our intervention is actually doing, I think is an important piece of the puzzle here as well.
That's great. And let's see here. So we have another note from a participant that a big challenge for cities is that most residents tend to be renters. So to make changes to the existing building stock, and the building stock is a big part of local climate mitigation and adaptation challenges, we have to motivate landlords. So the question is, how do we get past this type of split incentive problem? And, you know, I'd like to pose this question to Katrina about water bills, and then, you know, potentially first, for Zoe, it'd be great to see if you could speak to similar questions that you're seeing around housing stock as well.
This is a great question. It's one that I have noodled over in a failed experiment. I should say outside of water affordability. So kind of in my plan, what I had wanted to do, what we'd set up to do was we were actually going to do a randomized control trial. And the question we were interested in asking in this randomized control trial was, there were these energy efficiency programs available to commercial electricity customers, but no one was using them, like nobody, even though they were free. So you're only better off from doing them. And the question we had in mind was, why was nobody using them? And the main kind of hypothesis we wanted to test was the extent to which there was a divide between kind of those who actually kind of pay the electricity bill, right, and those who occupy the building, right? But in the water affordability context, kind of this problem exists as well, and kind of what the state, and I talked about this at the end, is thinking about is, how do you kind of make water affordable? What they're interested in asking is, how do you make water affordable when water rates are reflected in the rent you pay, and you're not necessarily paying the water bill? So if we give you a credit on your water bill, it's not going to go directly to you unless it's kind of transferred through the, if it's kind of transferred through or passed through the rent. So this is a great question. This is a question that can be asked through kind of well-designed experiments. Again, I've tried to do one that hasn't worked out, but others are working at this, right? How do we incentivize owners to invest in climate change mitigation and adaptation? I mean, what you can imagine is that depending on the incentive structure there, kind of who's paying bills and who's not, right, is kind of the renter paying the bill or the owner paying a bill, there's going to be a different incentive even there amongst the landlord to kind of invest in this. So that would be kind of first pass at it, right? How does investment differ depending on kind of whether an owner does or does not pay the bill in terms of energy efficiency investment?
Thank you, Katrina. That's really helpful. And I think we have just a minute left, and I'd love, Zoe, to hear from you quickly. I know, unfortunately, then we'll have to wrap up, but would love to hear any final thoughts from you.
Sure. Yeah, just very quickly, this is something that we've been thinking and talking pretty actively about, especially within the space of climate and green gentrification. And so when we're thinking about implementation of climate resilience interventions, just it really comes down to bringing both the renters and the owners to the table. But what was said sort of about incentivizing green and resilient solutions, that's something that we're sort of working actively on, so that when we're implementing solutions, it's really a matter of how are we bringing benefit to the community, not just trying to reduce heat, or not just trying to reduce flooding. But really adding public benefit. And so finding ways to integrate that into the prioritization process, and finding ways to identify metrics so that we are moving forward in that and can measure that is something that we're looking at as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And really, thank you so much again to our panelists. So Fiona, James, Katrina, Zoe, I'm just inspired by the work that you're doing, and we've learned so much from today's discussion. And many thanks as well to our webinar participants and for your thoughtful questions. There's so much more that we can discuss, and I encourage you to fill out a survey that we'll send at the end of the session today to let us know what other topics might be of interest. So from there, I'll hand it over to Jessica Tro, my colleague, for a quick note on other upcoming webinars in the series.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to thank Katrina, Fiona, James, and Zoe for such a great discussion today. It's really great hearing about all the opportunities that state and local governments have to respond to this ongoing climate crisis we're in. I just wanted to quickly remind everyone that in 3 weeks, October 27th, we'll have another webinar from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time on evaluations and racial equity. If you're not registered for the series, I did just send the link in the chat so you can register and get updates on that. If you were with us last week for our first webinar, you did hear my plug about opportunities to partner with JPAL, but just wanted to say this week too, if you're a state and local policymaker or a researcher that works with state and local governments, there are a couple of upcoming funding opportunities with JPAL through the State and Local Innovation Initiative opening in spring 2021. I know we're running out of time, so I won't get into details, but exact dates will be announced later this year. So just make sure you're subscribed to JPAL's newsletter and our State and Local Innovation Initiative mailing list to receive updates. I've shared a screen that has the next webinar information and also some contact information for both state and local and our climate sector. I'll leave it up for a little bit so you can screenshot it, and please get in touch with us if you have any questions or comments, or just want to talk to us about potential partnerships. That's it. Thank you so much for attending the webinar today, and we hope to see you in a few weeks for the next webinar. Thanks everyone. Bye.